Hello, good morning. So, my name is Ben Himmelfarb. I work at the White Plains Public Library, which is in Westchester County, and is technically in the Metro Library Council. So my primary purpose today is to do I have two primary purposes. One is to just show you the presentation that I used in some workshops that we did at our library and also outside the library in a couple different spots in town, and also share a little bit of reflection from a librarian, information worker, professional point of view on what I thought went well and what didn't. But I want to start with just an excerpt from a book. It's called, I wouldn't be a librarian if I weren't recommending a book during this presentation. So there's a great book by Svetlana Alexievich, who won the Nobel Prize, I think, for literature. It's called Secondhand Time, and it's an oral history of the end of the Soviet Union in the 90s. So this is a woman she interviewed talking about her experience during the first Chechen War, which is like 1994, 95, 96. At a train station in Moscow, I met a woman from the Tambov area. She was headed to Chechnya to take her son home. I don't want him to die. I don't want him to kill. The government no longer owned her soul. This was a free person. There were not many of them. More often, people were irritated with freedom. Quote, I buy 3 newspapers and each one of them has its own version of the truth. Where's the real truth? You used to be able to get up in the morning, read Pravda, and know all you needed to know, understand everything you needed to understand. Close quote. People were slow to come out from under the narcosis of old ideas. If I brought up repentance, the response would be, what do I have to repent for? Everyone thought of themselves as a victim, never a willing accomplice. One person would say, I did time too. Another, I fought in the war. A third, I built my city up from the ruins, hauling bricks day and night. Freedom had materialized out of thin air. Everyone was intoxicated by it, but no one had really been prepared. Where was this freedom? Only around kitchen tables, where out of habit people continued to badmouth the government. They reviled Yeltsin and Gorbachev, Yeltsin for changing Russia, Gorbachev for changing everything. The entire 20th century. Now we would live no worse than anyone else. We'd be just like everyone else. We thought that this time we finally get it right. So that's a Russian woman talking in the 90s, and kind of was brought home to me through my experience doing these workshops. So my formatting got messed up a little bit, but in the fall of 2016, before and after the presidential election, the phrase fake news was everywhere. Headlines, tweets, chyrons, email subject lines, a phrase that had been used to describe fringe or satirical content like the National Enquirer or The Onion was suddenly being applied to previously unassailable sources of news, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post. It seemed to us at the public library in White Plains that some news users were less surprised than others by the transformation that was taking place. We found that a person's level of surprise was usually proportionate to the amount of time they spent on the internet, as evidenced, I think, by the great presentation we just heard. If you spend a lot of time on the internet, you're probably not, waking up in 2016 shocked by, the dynamics around information and truth. So in 2016, though, the dog whistle had been dropped in favor of easily heard frequencies, and almost everyone had to adjust their way of thinking. It was a traumatic time for a lot of people, but we saw it as an opportunity. As a public library, we felt compelled to address the issue of fake news and information literacy for a few reasons. I will say first that we very self-consciously decided not to use the words information literacy, digital literacy, media literacy, any of that kind of stuff, to keep it more popular, more casual. So first, people were talking about it. At public service desks, people were coming up to us and, gesturing at a newspaper they were holding or at a TV on the wall and saying like, oh, can you believe X, Y, or Z? And second, as a supplier of media to people as a library, both mainstream and fringe media, we felt it was part of our basic mission to assist people who wanted to access information. And third, fake news really touched, such as it is fake news. That's kind of the shorthand I'll use for the whole thing. really touched on core values that our library had: intellectual freedom, equitable access, literacy, lifelong learning. Our mission at the public library in White Plains specifically calls on us to offer, quote, personal guidance in the use of information resources and provide diverse opportunities for cultural exchange and exploration of ideas. So we felt we could move forward and do programs and workshops around this topic in a way that wasn't going to really garner any sort of controversy. We felt we could do it in a way that was really principled. And I will report in general that we have had many, many more complaints about a series of concerts that we've had at the library that have been too loud than we had about any of these workshops. So Post-Truth Word of the Year 2016 by Oxford Dictionaries. It was helpful in the workshop to kind of go over some definitions with people, which is what these next few slides are. Post-truth actually was coined in 1992, and sums up our current situation pretty well. A lot of other times and a lot of other situations as well. But from the beginning, we wanted our workshops to take place outside the building. I identified a bunch of different groups to approach about, our workshop. Sorry, I lost my mouse here. There it is. Just had to scroll through my notes a little bit. It's back. It's all good. All right, so I identified a bunch of different groups. We ended up holding workshops with a youth group for young women of color, a group of retired men, a current events discussion group that met in a diner, an adult education group based out of a synagogue, our local Rotary Club, another organization that helps seniors maintain independence and integration in the community. We also had a few sessions at the library because there are people who want to come to the library for programs. But at any workshop, I felt that people would benefit from a presentation at the beginning of the session, hence the slides with the kind of, somewhat pedantic stuff, but really just conversation starters. It wasn't hard to... all I did really was invite people to talk about it. You didn't really have to get people to talk about this issue. I began each workshop by taking a poll. What were people's main sources of news? As one would expect, younger people tended to rely more on the internet, while older people relied more on television and print news. However, there were a lot of older people who thought of themselves as print news consumers, Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, but they only ever read those things online. Many of them didn't have an understanding that the front page, the home page of the New York Times was not the same as the front page of the New York Times, that lands on your doorstep, or at least used to in Westchester. I don't know I suppose that still exists somewhere. Teens, when you would say, where do you get news from? They would usually say, Facebook, Tumblr, Snapchat, Twitter, YouTube. But when pushed, I wasn't pleasantly surprised. I had met these young women before, so I knew they were bright. But they said, well, we know that Facebook doesn't, quote, make the news. It's like CNN on Facebook, or it's, Unicorn Ninja on Twitter or something like that. So there was already a lot of sophistication among people that I think often gets overlooked in kind of the splashier popular stories about, how effective whatever 20 people outside of St. Petersburg were in manipulating the psyches of the American public. I think that's a little too all or nothing. The presentation included examples to address bias from both liberal and conservative ends of the political spectrum. Honestly, people were relieved to talk about the kind of the meta conversation. Not that we called it that, but they were relieved to talk about the news and not talk about the details. The story du jour was changing all the time. Everyone kind of would say the thing of 1 week feels like a year. And they were really interested in talking about the information environment, about their experiences with news. So a few discussion questions I had that were surprisingly fruitful were, when was the last time you had your mind changed on an issue, and how did that happen? Do you have friends or family you disagree with politically but manage to talk to or maintain a relationship with? Have you ever shared an article or video online without reading or watching it first? And, all of these questions I had my own kind of personal answers to. I didn't try and set up a dynamic where I was, up in front of the class lecturing, and we will have Q&A, so this isn't going to be that either. But I tried to actually talk as little as possible, and the workshops really went best when, people were having their own conversations. So presenting open-ended questions that people of all political backgrounds could answer was super key to facilitating healthy and, I'll say civil conversations, even though there were plenty of heated conversations that happened during the workshops. There were people with differing views on a number of issues. There were people who voted for Trump. There were people who voted for Clinton. They oftentimes they kind of already knew that about each other because they were in a given group that we went and said, hey, would you want to have us do, lead a workshop on fake news? But some of them were strangers, were people who just met by coming to the workshop. I was really not into formal evaluation. I don't really like formal evaluation. I relied on basically just informal conversations with people and unsolicited feedback to evaluate the program. I don't know how many of people can probably identify with this, but I don't know about you. I get a lot of unsolicited feedback on almost everything our library does. So just paying attention to that and taking it seriously was a good way to evaluate the program. Also, the fact that people said, hey, I had a really good time at this, or, who really, they would often say, like, my husband goes to a thing on Thursday nights and they really need this program, and then they would give us the information and we would go do it there. There were some kind of like revelatory moments, some anecdote kind of things, that, a woman who I believe was in her 60s, she was at this diner at the discussion group, and she took out her phone and was like, well, I just go to, the news app, which I think was like the Apple News app that came with her phone. And she clicked it open, and her friend said, oh yeah, I use that too. And she clicked it open, and they compared it and realized that they both looked different, that when they opened their apps, algorithms, et cetera, gave them different results. And she was like, it was like Pravda had stopped being published, is what it was like. She really was blown away by that. Since this was, after all, a library program, it wouldn't have been complete without some hostile interrogation of the librarian. So we were deep into a conversation on the nature of truth. And one participant asked me, well, would the library put the National Enquirer on the shelf next to the New Yorker and the Economist? I mean, you can't really do that, can you? And I, along with everyone else in the room, laughed. My answer, though, probably was not what she expected. I told her, we have a collections development policy. It dictates, it's the guidelines we use to decide what to add to our collection. If there was sufficient demand for it, of course, we would buy it, and it would be located with the other periodicals. And she said, but what if someone picked it up and read that Hillary Clinton had an alien baby, ironically, example we already saw. She said, what would you tell them if they told you that? I said, I would go through the same process with that person that I would with anyone else who wanted me to help them, verify a story. We would look for corroboration, blah, 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 going through all that. And then she said, but the National Enquirer, it's pure fiction. And I said, we also have a section for that. And, we then got into this discussion that was about the truth in stories and versus, this kind of like obsessive fact checking and kind of like rational browbeating that happens a lot from, I think mostly on the liberal side of the media, but from all kind of establishment media. And, there's a reason why, the fiction section is just as big, if not bigger, than the nonfiction section. So outright conflict during the workshops was very rare. people, just kind of manage that themselves. So it's been 10 minutes or 15? It's been 15? Okay. So I'm just going to talk for a minute or two more, and then we'll do questions. There was a really interesting, this group that I met with at the synagogue was very fiery, and there was a lot of cheek pinching of me, which was, nice. Normally it's not nice to be touched at work in the library, but they got into this thing over the New York Times. One person felt the New York Times was too pro-Palestinian, but felt that its domestic political reporting was very good. And another person felt that the Times was too pro-Israel, but that its domestic reporting was too conservative. So they had these views that were shooting past each other and overlapping and intersecting, and they had never really dug into the details of those views with each other. They had always just kind of done, a classic Israel-Palestine thing, which of course, can go on and on. The other thing that happened at this workshop at the synagogue that was really interesting was it was a bunch of older people, seniors, and one of them was kind of flabbergasted, or not flabbergasted, but, kind of overwhelmed. And she said, well, I don't even know what to do. Who's going to tell me what's true anymore? And one of her friends really admonished her and said, why are you asking for someone to tell you what the truth is? You have to go out and find it. That's what's, and she kind of did a little you could hear the trumpets or whatever. She was like, that's what America's all about. We have the freedom to go seek information and produce information and explore and share our opinions. And it was kind of maybe the most patriotic I felt in a long time. So, to answer kind of the question that was brought up in the last presentation, well, what do we do? I mean, this workshop itself was often cited by people who were there and by people I've told about the workshop as a healthy response to current conditions. Get people in a room, maybe only looking at one screen, but hopefully looking at each other, talking, listening, having a face-to-face interaction, experiencing the discomfort of, sharing space with someone who has a different opinion than them. Also, kind of having the willingness to maybe have their mind changed. People I think had more information skills within them than they realized. That was another kind of great thing about the program was seeing people teach each other. Often we experience media on our own in a very individualized way. Library actually in the lobby of our library we have local news on a TV, and people stand around and watch it and talk. And that's not a way most people consume media anymore. With that, I don't think there's anything I want to say except the biggest lesson I learned was not to overplan. Don't overplan. Leave it, open a little bit. But I probably don't need to tell you that. You probably already know that. I had to learn it. So with that, thank you, and we'll do Q&A. Yeah.
All right, we have 5 minutes for questions. Any takers? Yeah. Would you mind passing this over?
Okay. Hi. So I wanted to ask you one question. I know that you had mentioned you talked to the groups about sharing things online without actually reading the articles. And I think this is something I've seen a lot, and I'm really curious to see if you can just elaborate a little bit about what their reactions were, what people had said, if they've seen that happen a lot, or if they were guilty of doing it themselves.
I need to steal it from you so I can answer.
I mean, let's just do it in this room. Who has shared something online without clicking on it or reading it, or who's just clicked retweet or share or something? It's no shame. It's so it's pretty common. People also felt like, well, I'm sharing a New York Times article. They've already done the work of verifying this article. I don't need to I don't need to dig deeper into it. So then we talked about, well, what do you think you're sharing when you share the article? And actually that example, again, of the Antifa Sutherland Springs shooting article, right? Where it's like, if you clip that headline a certain way, it looks like it's saying Antifa did the Sutherland Springs shooting. And so we talked about how you should at least click on something and follow it through because it may be different than what it's kind of being exerted as. But then also just kind of owning it, you know, like maybe say, hey, I didn't read this, but I felt like I should retweet it, and, you know, retweet it then. Transparency was kind of the most important thing that came out of that discussion with people. No one was willing to commit to not doing it. So.
This will be our last question for Ben.
Thanks, Ben. You mentioned that you didn't call the workshops media literacy or information literacy workshops, but I didn't catch the name of the workshops. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you named them, and then if participants themselves talked about issues of information literacy, but what are these skills being called by the communities themselves, and then what were your reasonings for not using those words? Thanks.
That's a good question. We just called them fake news workshops. It was shorthand. It kind of got across what what the topic was. Is this still on? Yeah. We said, come learn about how to, read the news better, or learn how to learn the difference between reliable news and unreliable sources. And people often said, people talked a lot about individual responsibility for seeking out the truth. Like people don't talk about it in technical terms. They talk about it in those like kind of broad, almost like narrative terms, right? Like the truth of the situation, or well, how do you know what really happened on the street in Ferguson? Just by watching a video. And it wasn't. I guess one advantage of kind of doing this program the way we did it, as far as reaching out to already established community groups, was these people understood each other and already had a little bit of community, maybe not around this particular topic. The ones at the library were a little more heterogeneous, with people coming in, and in those situations, actually, I did bring up information literacy a couple times because we were in the library and I kind of felt obliged to. But overall, people use plain speak, not newspeak.